podcast every single day at 8 p.m. Central. Keep an eye on the announcements channel in the server to see all our great upcoming events. We have a great debate coming up tomorrow at 8, for example. And make sure you've checked out the hashtag RT podcast channel, where you can like, follow, and subscribe to our 4 different podcast content channels. We have a YouTube video channel, a YouTube older archive channel with hundreds of great episodes, as well as our current latest and greatest channel, and also a great BitChute channel. And remember, all of those are unique podcasts, so you want to follow them all, check them all out, because they all have different episodes. That being said, welcome, Thoth. Thank you so much for coming to join me. How are you, sir?
I'm doing well. I hope you all are as well this evening. So, as I am to recall, we are going to be discussing what alchemy is and the nature of it, and what use it has, as well as the relevance of it used here and today.
That would be wonderful. I would love to talk about that. So if you have an idea of where you want to start and you'd like to do a presentation type format, that's 100% fine. Or I can ask you a series of interview questions and use that a way to get into it. What would you prefer?
I suppose I'll begin out with just explaining the gist of what many people have come to understand alchemy to be, thought it to be throughout the ages, and what it actually is. First off, most people understand alchemy to be the work of charlatans, which is understandable when you start to analyze all the different misconceptions of it throughout the ages. Alchemy throughout time has oftentimes been associated with people seeking to turn lead into gold. Unfortunately, a lot of people do not understand that in and of itself is a metaphor for what it really is for. The human mind begins out simple and crude. None of us begin out brilliant. Even Albert Einstein had a point he was just beginning his learning, and then a later point he was even then, while wizened, still beginning his theories and deeper understandings. Alchemy is refining the human mind from being crude, uninsightful, and uninspired, as well as the sense of character, to where both are inspired, open, capable, fluid, and very competent. And this would be the goal that alchemy seeks to make. However, many people did not understand this even into modern times, which, as you can understand, it is about self-refinement and perfection of the mind. It has relevance in any age and any era.
That's a great introduction. Thank you very much. So when we begin with alchemy, again, you gave a wonderful introduction, but how would you sort of lay the 101 groundwork in terms of what is the goal of alchemy? What is its purpose? What is the general teleological purpose of the discipline?
The point of alchemy was, in order, as I mentioned before, to learn to refine oneself, but also to know oneself. It's often overlooked because we lead such hasty and fast-paced lives that a lot of us in this day and age do not know ourselves. We do not understand ourselves, and it is rare people these days take the time and they really look inside themselves. They pause and they ask themselves questions. They figure out how they feel, why they feel, and how that might impact the course of their life and even the people around themselves. The point of alchemy was to help a person, through better understanding the reality and the nature of the reality around themselves, to understand themselves, and through that to better master and manipulate their own selves to become and be who and what they felt they needed and wanted to be.
I see. Thank you. So would it be fair to say that alchemy is primarily a system of personal development, personal cultivation, and almost achieving some kind of enlightenment or apotheosis? Is that like the ultimate goal is to perfect the self?
That would be a fair synopsis of it, because the point of it, though it is a never-ending staircase, is to always work on oneself. And when one has that, there is really no limit to what they can achieve, what they can learn, and what they can do, not only for themselves, but for others as well.
I see. So let's say that someone, a young man or woman, perhaps, maybe 20 years old or something, said, I think there's something to this alchemy thing. I want to study alchemy. I want to learn. What would be your advice to that person who's just brand new? Like, what is their first step to get into this like ancient, mysterious practice?
It is a wonderful question. It has been decades since I myself first began learning it, and I remember having to go through many different websites, many different very old books, which back then made very little, if any, sense to me because they're written in a Shakespearean manner, which eventually you'll find to be second nature, but the first time you read such a book, it is not so easy. And the best place I would say is natural is for a person to approach it through the seven sacred metals: lead, tin, silver, mercury, iron, copper, and gold. It may not seem like these would have a lot to do with the individual, but each of these metals reflect an aspect of our own nature and a side to ourselves. And by working through the nature of the metal and understanding it as well as how it corresponds to us, we can better come to understand ourselves and therefore begin to work through the problems we want to work through, and then come to know ourselves a little bit more with each and every question we resolve.
Fascinating. So to what extent does alchemy necessarily require physical materials? Is alchemy something that can be done only with knowledge and a book, so to speak? Or is this something you really require, alembics and calcinators and retorts and the different, alchemical tools, whatever you call them? Like, do you need a laboratory to do alchemy?
At one point in time, believe it or not, it was encouraged by practicing alchemists to do such a thing. But in this day and age, I would not advise people to really go out on a limb and do such a thing, since not only do we have such an interconnected world with a plethora of information and doctrines about all those subjects, but it's also dangerous to do actual chemistry and metallurgy itself if a person is not well versed in them. So thankfully, one does not need any of those devices to practice and study alchemy. Now, there are people that push the art to the point they want to know the physical side of it, but in this day and age, as I mentioned, one could literally go to chemistry and alchemy, not how, I apologize, chemistry as well as metallurgy, to analyze those things even down to a molecular level, which, as we know, our ancestors had little or no insight into that degree of it.
I see. So let's say that you were, now I'm going to jump from the new student just setting out to yourself personally. So let's say you today wanted to do some alchemy, right? You were going to engage in the practice and the discipline of alchemy. Can you give us just a little like practical walkthrough of what you would actually do? How you would actually go about this in a concrete sense, right? Like, and you can use any example because I'm sure you do lots of different kinds of operations or projects with alchemy. But maybe just walk someone through an example of what a session of alchemy might actually look like so people can kind of visualize a little more what it entails.
Well, that becomes complicated. Normally there's a question positioned in and of itself, and that would be associated back to the metal that's respective for it. However, let's see. If I were to ask myself, for example, why is it I get angry at X? I would begin to break down the basic reasons and begin to ask myself how that began, where it began, what started it and why it started, how it makes me feel and why that makes me feel that way, and how it impacts others around me. If I alter it in this way, that way, yet another way, and yet another way, how that might change the outcome, why it would change it, and how I feel about those things. Through doing this, I can begin to analyze what might be, what has been, and what could be, and determine which way I really want these things to go. And then I have to ask myself, even after that, while calculating through the questions, how do I really want it to end up going? And what steps are necessary to fulfill that?
So is it in any sense divination, divinatory, or is it only introspective, contemplative, and reflective? So are you achieving through the interaction with the metals something like an augury, like seeing some kind of supernatural insight into the future? Or is it more like a meditative practice through which you're able to derive insights?
I would call it more a meditative practice that also dips heavily into the art of correspondence. As we all know, all things within the universe relate on some level and in some way. Alchemy, at its core, is understanding that correspondence in order to utilize that to self-analyze and self-refine. By doing this, you can achieve all manner of results. There's been people that did wonderful things with it, and there's been people that literally turn themselves into monsters using it. It's all about what the person sees, desires, wants, and then sets out to achieve. Now, to explain why it might sound profound from the mystical writings and why it does not seem as profound as it would be then as it is today. In ancient times, it is commonly understood that if you were a blacksmith's son, not only would your last name be Smith, you would be raised to understand that that's all you were in that day and time. That's how those people thought. It was not a common understanding or contemplation that a man or woman could be or do anything. They all lived within quite the cookie cutter. Alchemists were unique in the sense that they not only understood a man could aspire to be anything and do anything, but they had the mental practices necessary in an antiquated time to achieve this.
Very interesting. So, speaking of antiquated times, what do we know, or what would you say about the origins historically of alchemy? Do we know where it originated? Who the first alchemists might have been? Like what country it's mostly developed in, or any of that kind of origin information?
We're to understand it as an Egyptian-based practice from the land of Kem or Kemet. And while we do not know the original practitioners, how they found it, how they set it up, and why they devised it in the ways they did, we know that their teachings ended up echoing across all of Europe and eventually throughout all of history as it's recorded, because these people have been around simply as long as they have. You'd be hard-pressed to go back through times that man was active and not find alchemical practices, even if it was not named that at such a time.
Very interesting. So, to what extent is there an intersection, and what can you say about the intersection or the overlap between alchemy and the practice of magic, whether that be ceremonial magic or some other occult practice? In what way and to what extent are these two disciplines connected, would you say?
Within correspondence, we can find where they're connected through the means of the natures of the metals, as well as the natures of gemstones, and the natures of intent and emotion. Alchemy understands and looks into all these things just as a practice of trying to better understand the reality, to better understand ourselves, and to better understand where all things fit. Magic requires an understanding of these things because if you really break down a magical ritual, you'll find every single object there has some reflection on what's wanting to be achieved. If a person wanted a protective influence, they would probably have an aluminum substance present in order to build their altar, their pentacle, glyph, or whatever, what have you, because aluminum is a metal that's associated with protection. However, if they wanted a caustic result, or one that was even toxic, they'd probably involve mercury. Where they would get that in this day and age, that's anyone's guess, but all things had a purpose and a correspondence to them. That is to say, the alchemy itself would not come into play in using the magical arts, but the knowledge it grants would most certainly help someone that is a practitioner of such things.
I apologize. I got
No.
disconnected there. Can you hear me?
Yes. What did you last hear?
Hold on. I seem to be having a technical issue. I'll be right back.
All right.
Just a reminder that this pause can be edited out later.
Welcome back. How is that coming along right now, Shogun?
Hi there. So sorry about that. I had a technical glitch. I apologize. We had just been speaking about the connection between alchemy and magic, and you'd given a good answer to that question. So can I continue then by asking, are there core fundamental books, texts that are absolutely essential for any alchemist to read? What are the most important books or texts that an alchemist would study when they start researching this, would you suggest?
Many people like to go into the Kabbalah in order to begin their journey and their studies, and this is because this was a channeled work written by some divinators that supposedly were drawing from ancients that understood the art on a profound level, and many modern practitioners would concede that it is a profound book. This is a good book to begin with. The Corpus Hermeticum itself also serves to offer many alchemical insights. But on top of that, when one progresses down the road to test their knowledge, they can always read the Emerald Tablet itself and see if they comprehend the alchemical practice being taught within it, since all it is teaching is an alchemy practice.
Thank you. So I'm wondering, can alchemy be used for the purposes of physical healing? In other words, can you produce medicines or treatments for conditions or illnesses by using alchemy?
I suppose that would be a thing if one was able to study far enough to reach the branch of it known as spagyrics, Spagyrix. Spagyrics is essentially herbalism and holistic medicine, but it was all the teachings that were taken before modern medicine. And it's interesting to find early, and I do mean very early doctors, knew and studied spagyrics as well as holistic medicine, but it since fell out of practice with what many people call the era of silver bullet cures.
Interesting. So along the same line, is it possible, in your opinion, for someone using alchemy to achieve effects that we might commonly conceive of as supernatural, magical, or paranormal? Or is it all happening within the realm of what we would consider coherent with mainstream science, right? So in other words, can alchemy do, in your opinion, things that modern science is not able to account for, or is it more a spiritual interpretation of science, or is it a proto-science? How would you look at that?
I enjoy describing alchemy as proto-science, as you can find many aspects of science grew from alchemy in these earlier studies. After all, science did not just arise out of the hoary mists of legend all on its lonesome. There were earlier minds behind their foundation. But with that said, There are a handful of things that you could readily see where people associated it with the supernatural and magic, and less so over time did they do that because we expanded our understanding and mastery of science. One of the most comical but common sense examples of this is how you can throw various minerals into a fire and readily change the color of it. While we know what that is doing in this day and age, you go dial it back even 1,000 years and no one knew what that was. They didn't know what was happening. To them, that was very mystical and spiritual. Today, very much less so. However, then there are sides to alchemy that, due to the 7 sacred principles within it, it tends to accompany it through hermetics. There are things that science simply cannot presently do. But I don't say that because I feel science is totally unable. Science likes things to be fully sorted out, fully studied, fully tested, and if there's any error, margin for error, they will tend to push it off the table. For example, it is understood that vibration is a very, very powerful principle that can lift impossibly sized objects and keep them suspended. It can improve or destabilize molecular bonds. They have been learning how to use vibration to do non-invasive surgery. And what else it can do really is anyone's guess. It is even considered it's possible that we can even do cold smelting of minerals and metals using vibration alone, which means you could shape a metal just using the right vibrational frequency. And if all that's possible, we can only imagine what truly gifted scientists might achieve with it.
Fascinating. Can you maybe give us an example from your life, a real example from your memories, of an interesting alchemical experiment, procedure, or practice that you at one time did, and what you learned from that experience? Just to again help people get sort of an experiential insight into the life of the alchemist, the practicing alchemist.
I use it very often, so give me just a second to think of one that a person might not roll their eyes at because it would seem like something you do any given day, but an alchemist will approach using alchemy in most things, and it's just a different approach for them. So one moment. I suppose one of the most profound uses I got out of alchemy that, given anyone's interpretation, may or may not be so great to them is I used it to look at my life, the life of my family and my parents, and unfold them bit by bit. And looking at it through the lens of each sacred metal, I evaluated each individual to figure out where in the ladder of development each individual really was. If the advice and experiences they had and offered other people were really credible, and if they should have been the ones really giving that advice. And as I laid it out systematically in this way, I came to find who I could rely on better advice for, seek better guidance with, and other people that I may have been looking up to in the past that simply were not valuable for such an insight, because when you broke it down to the metallic system, they were at a stage of development that did not correspond with being a good guide as opposed to these other individuals. Now, as I grew as an individual, I realized it gets a little more complicated. A person can be of a golden nature in terms of, say, patience, but then they might also be of a very lead nature in other areas. Being golden in one aspect does not mean a person has reached utter perfection, much like how the enlightenment is more akin to a staircase, not a single higher plateau one just reaches.
Fascinating. Thank you. So I'm wondering, do you have more that you want to cover as regards alchemy in specific, or would you be open to expanding the conversation somewhat to adjacent topics, such as Hermeticism and Magick?
I am open to side topics as well as questions. Before we move on to other things, though, it would be good to ask if anyone has questions for us.
Good idea. So, on the subject of alchemy, you guys have heard a great introduction from Mr. Thoth. Does anyone have a question or a comment about alchemy before we move into other topics? Feel free to speak up if anyone has a question. Otherwise, I'll continue the interview.
Yeah, just on you know,
Sorry, you seem to be cutting in and out.
the general principles. I'm sure you're familiar with salt, mercury, and sulfur.
Gain,
Yes, I am.
perhaps repeat your question, unless it was on my end. You were mostly cutting out at that side. Can you guys hear me? I can't tell if he's cutting out or what's going on.
I
I
did not
can-
hear
Yes.
him. He cut off a bit in the middle.
Yeah, Gain, you need to leave the room and rejoin, and you can attempt to re-ask if you want. Do you want to try again, Gain? We couldn't hear you. Okay. Gain doesn't seem to be working. Does anyone else have a question for Mr.
I have a
Thoth?
question for him actually.
Go ahead, Zedman.
I mean, are we? I mean, it's a question about like maybe. Do you know like the connection or like the relationship between like alchemy and its ancient like manifestation and the medicine as well? Because I think they go hand to hand as well. Because like what do you think about like medicine at ancient times? Were they considered alchemists as well?
We covered that earlier. Spagyrics was what was used as medicine in ancient times, and that was a branch of alchemy. An ancient alchemist not only was a philosopher, but he was also a metallurgist and an herbalist. But in herbalism, they also practiced chemistry as well as within metallurgy. But in this day and age, it all got segregated to the point they are all their respective domains.
Right.
That's
And
cool.
yeah, we did pass that one over, but it's not bad to ask it again, I suppose. Does anyone else have a question for Mr. Mr.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, go ahead, give it
Hello?
a shot.
Okay, yeah, my question was, the general principles. I'm sure you're familiar with, salt, mercury, and sulfur, and also the elemental principles of earth, water, air, and fire. And I was wondering what you thought of these. What if they correlated to more thick things that we would identify now, and just like how they fit into the larger general principle of alchemy.
You're asking how the salt, sulfur, and mercury play a role within it.
And also the elemental principles of earth, water, air, and fire.
While those are quite classical at this point, they were very important at the point in time that the alchemists were still using correspondence to better understand the self through the world around themselves. In this day and age, we have so much information available at our fingertips, it seems less necessary, but the reason these people used these was each of those had a valuable point. Salt was the principle of fixity. Mercury was the principle of fusibility and volatility, and sulfur was the principle of inflammability. Each of the elements also covered entire wings of character traits, personality traits, and ways of things. And within each of the elements, you could also embody everything within the world covered under one or more of them.
Thank you.
Thoth?
Was there anyone else who had a question on alchemy?
Wait, let them continue.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought that was the end of your answer.
Thoth. Is there someone else going?
I guess someone else was continuing their question. Go ahead. No? All right. I suppose he was done then. Did you have a question, Hugh?
Yes, Thoth, what is your view or perception on using pure magic like actual bliss energy to induce alchemical processes?
I myself am not capable of doing such a thing, I am sad to say, but if one were able to do that, that is absolutely phenomenal and quite a development. As I was taught, magic has two major branches, thaumaturgy and theurgy. One of them is a very internal art and uses specifically one's will. The other one is an external art that seeks to use the nature of the universe itself and draw on higher powers in order to magnify one's will and achieve results should the universe be willing. But if one is able to do what you described, that is phenomenal.
I would like to talk with you sometime about that if you're okay with that.
Absolutely. Just send me a DM and we can discuss it later.
Great. Now, does anyone else have a question on the subject of alchemy? Because there's a nice segue there to something else we could get into, but I want to give one more opportunity for anyone who has an alchemy-specific question. Now's your chance. Okay, so you had mentioned thaumaturgy and theurgy in your last exposition, and my understanding is these are essentially two forms or schools of magic, essentially. So can you talk a little bit about magic as an introduction to the concept, and then maybe we can discuss thaumaturgy and theurgy in specific? So to make my question explicit for those who are not familiar or who have only misconceptions about magic, how would you define and introduce it to such people?
All right, to explain it, theurgy essentially means divine working. It is using what we know as the sacred arts, and many of these actually are not even able to be found online. Even if you go into our Library of Alexandria, you'd be hard-pressed to find the most profound texts on the sacred arts. The difference between thaumaturgy and theurgy essentially is that oftentimes theurgy is where you will find the arts of oracles and divination, and any mention of miracles would immediately fall under theurgy. It draws on higher powers or external powers or even the planet itself, depending on the religious practice. Thaumaturgy, though, is the use of magic for non-religious purposes, the art and science of wonder working, using magic to actually change things in the physical world.
Very, very interesting indeed. So you had mentioned in your DMs to me that you felt that I didn't think you were being joking, but you said that you're a failure at theurgy. And I was wondering, does that mean that you have more success with thaumaturgy and less with theurgy? Do you practice both of these yourself personally in the current time?
When I was being groomed and raised into the position I presently have, they did not actually teach me personally, the arts. They left me the books, and I was left to have to figure it out on my own, which anyone that has studied magic books, there are many allegories, and when left to one's imagination, it could mean a whole lot of things what you're trying to learn. I myself am capable at channeling in communion, but when it came to manifestation, I came to learn that was a much more difficult art, and I am still, even to this day, learning to perfect that, if I will ever perfect it, or if anyone will ever totally perfect it. I prefer to work within communion with higher forces rather than through my own will, because when it came to thaumaturgy itself, a key thing within thaumaturgy is desire and intent. But I myself do not particularly desire anything besides the world to become a better place, people to be more comfortable, and people to know themselves better. So I was never able to practice it willy-nilly because I did not have personal desires to really try to impress.
I see. You mentioned your current position, being prepared for it, and I want to make sure that I get into this. So you are the elder and the well, what would I say, the caretaker of something called the Library of Alexandria. So can you just tell us a little bit about this project? What is the Library of Alexandria that you're involved in? Yeah, we'll start with that. Can you just talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. As many people will know, the original Library of Alexandria burnt down an unspecific amount of time ago. But it actually did not just burn once comically. It has burnt about 5 or 6 times in total. A good many of those times it was completely by accident. A few other times it was by pillagers or raiders. And since such a time, we have not had the number of ready and willing devout that were trained stonemasons to necessarily rebuild such a massive structure, nor did we have the physical texts readily on hand. So over the years, in this modern age, we've collected all the different and diverse manuscripts on the divine we could gather in all the different ways of life, and we've collected them into that within the unified orders of Hermeticism, which is what I work over. I also keep the library, which, thankfully, for all that it is and is not, mostly means keeping the peace, keeping people from different religions that do visit and study there from fighting amongst themselves, and to help people with any questions they may or may not have as they're visiting it.
Great. You do have this in the form of a Discord server. So everybody, please make sure, if you're interested in these topics, to join Mr. Thoth's Discord server, the Library of Alexandria. And, when you have a chance, or if you can, just send me that link. I will post it in the general chat for everybody so they can find it easily. I believe it should also be in our partners channel. But I just wanted to make sure that you guys know that you can find all kinds of great resources there and lots of good advice on these topics. So I wanted to get into that. So returning to the subject of magic and the occult, magic in particular, to what extent do you understand these practices to function by interfacing with non-human intelligences such as spirits, angels, or demons? In other words, is that inherently part of magic, or is only some kinds of magic concerned with this?
Well, as I keep analyzing it, I came to understand it all does literally come down to one particular venue that reaches out into all of the others, energy work, because energy corresponds with vibration. All energy vibrates on a different level. When a person's trying to reach out to a higher spirit, for example, they're trying to vibrate on a similar frequency to it so that they can channel it partially into themselves and commune with it. Some people will try to place it within an object and be within proximity to it. Others may want to use sigils to bind it, though I do not advise that so much. It's considered offensive. But if one were not familiar with energy work whatsoever, and I do not necessarily mean crystals or incense, then one would struggle to work within these domains. It's not all magic would necessarily need spirits, deities, or even deceased people to work within, but there are branches of it that definitely do such a thing.
I see. So when you talk about magic, is the kind of magic that you concern yourself most with ceremonial magic in the Western esoteric tradition, the ceremonial magical form? Is that the kind that you are most emphasizing?
I myself was, and probably always will be drawn towards ones that focus on purifying the energies within an area and trying to correct imbalances in the world around myself. And I can certainly attest that there are some places in the world they are weird. And that's putting it kindly and lightly. There are places that things happen that if we were to just use science, what's happening makes no sense there. And there are times that you do need purification arts in order to get that place just back to being normal.
I see. And again, to what extent do you believe that the art of magic is capable of creating effects that people might describe as supernatural or paranormal? Does it work within existing laws of physics and reality as we understand them, or is it in some sense an exception to those rules, or a way to overrule or bypass them? So, in other words, does magic have the capability of achieving, in your opinion, true supernatural effects, or is it more in the domain of another form of sort of therapeutic introspection, meditation, and contemplation, and that kind of thing?
I have remained on the fence on that matter for a very long time because I have witnessed some things that, even to this day, with plenty of reflecting upon it, I cannot tell you what happened. However, in analysis, I can tell you that the mind is extremely powerful, and there is a reason that ancients made it the pinnacle and crown principle of Hermetics, that mentalism. Mind over matter can achieve things that science, if it were left entirely on its lonesome, would not be able to explain.
I certainly agree with you on that, my friend. As regards to organizations within the occult, such as secret societies or initiatory traditions, anything from the Order of the Golden Dawn to Freemasonry to, you name the group, right? Are you engaged formally with any such group, or have you been? Or were you self-taught, or are you part of an existing esoteric tradition or group?
I was groomed through the study of the manuscripts, and I wish that I had known about the Golden Dawn, maybe the good 20 or more years ago that my own journey began, but I was not aware of such a people, and by the time I was old enough and on my own to have found them, the person I had found for it, comically enough, wanted money from me. They did not want to discuss philosophy. They did not want to espouse wisdom. They were concerned only about money. This left a bitter taste in my mouth and left me determined that Hermeticism needed reformation in a group that was intent only on the study, only on the art, and only on the preservation of knowledge and sharing it with people interested in finding it. Because Hermetics is not about money, and it's not about being successful or unsuccessful by society's metrics. So, unfortunately, even to this day, I am not associated with them. But I hope one day the unified orders of Hermeticism and the Golden Dawn might be able to sit at the same table and break bread and commune together.
Nice, a noble vision indeed. So, similar to my previous question about alchemy, if someone was, again, perhaps a young person, newly reaching adulthood, wanted to begin to become an accomplished and adept magician, such as yourself, what would you recommend should be their very first step or steps?
That is
So
a wonderful question.
Sorry, go ahead.
I would advise they first begin with the Corpus Hermeticum. While it is a Hermetic book in their core book itself, one must come to understand that Hermetics is first and foremost a system of philosophy. This book can help them to break down the understanding and enter into the mental state necessary for well digesting those principles and concepts. From there, I would suggest the Kabbalion, as well as they look into Kabbalah, because it helps. The Tree of Life and the Sephiroth really helps to explain it and explain the mental side of it.
Thank you very much for that answer. In terms of an actual practice, is there one that people should do as they're beginning their path? Is there a particular magical operation, ritual, ceremony, or working that is a good one for a brand new mage or magician?
I know this is going to sound a bit antiquated, traditional, and silly to some, but learn meditation. Practice it regularly and learn to not only calm and still your mind, but to direct and handle it freely, readily, and capably. It may sound silly, but most people I've met in modern day, I have met countless people that even say, if you asked, what are you thinking right now? The answer would be nothing. And it baffles me at the state I'm at these days that anyone would ever be able to answer nothing to that question. A person that wishes to be a magician should more than be able to give a long and lengthy answer to that question, because their mind should always be active. There should always be some mystery they're looking into or some facet of themselves that they're analyzing. The world is too big, too vast, and too complicated not to have something you're considering.
Indeed so. Indeed so. So, as regards the concept of religion, I guess my first question is, do you, this is sort of not one question, but you'll get my gist. Do you believe in God, and do you consider yourself religious, is my first question. And my second, follow-up question to that is, do you believe that there's any conflict or contradiction between having a traditional faith such as Christianity or perhaps, Islam or Judaism, whatever the case may be, and the practice of magic, or are these two completely harmonious as far as you're concerned?
I'll answer the second part first. It's comical you'd ask that from what I've learned in studying theology, because, as I mentioned, theurgy, every faith at some point during their timeline had sacred arts. For example, King Solomon was the one that had the sacred arts of Christianity. But if you were to go into a Christian church and ask them if they know about the Key of Solomon, they probably would not think too fondly of that question and inquiry. But all the same, this was their very own sacred arts, and they do not practice it in this day and age. So I would say it's absolutely harmonious, but it takes the person understanding the purpose and context based within the outlook of the faith as well. Now, regarding if I am religious, Hermetics does identify that there is a source and a creator, an intelligent design behind the entire universe, and oneness with them is part of the practice of alchemy. However, it is not expected that all alchemists will be fixated on or looking towards the source. Many of them will not be seeking gold, which would be that oneness and that elevated consciousness one can achieve there.
Thank you for that answer. So in a related question, how literally do you think of the concepts of angels, spirits, and demons? Are these in truth non-human but entirely real entities with consciousnesses and powers? Or do you take a more psychological view that these perhaps are elements of our subconscious or some kind of symbolic manifestations without external reality?
I'd like to answer that in length, but that would be quite the long discussion. I do believe, if I could say both, I'd like to go into detail, but be awkward because I'm better at typing out that, because there's so much to go into, and I did not necessarily bring a script, that I'd feel like I'd end up oftentimes going in circle on the subject when I was trying to keep going down the path of it. It's a very deep topic. I can say in my own studies, I learned that in ancient times the word demon didn't exist. The word angel did not exist. Instead they had daimon, D-A-I-M-O-N. If we look into ancient language, this is described by the ancients as an ancient, wise soul. That explains to us that more than likely many of these beings were either created long before the world, and or they were souls that had reincarnated so many times that they eventually reached a point that they were just confined within the spiritual realms, and they may still reach to others through esoteric means, but may or may not be embodied here.
I understand. Again, I'm just sort of asking any question that comes into my mind. I want to pick your brain as much as I can, since you know, I know you're a busy guy, and we don't get you in here all the time. What role, if any, do you see the use of psychoactive drugs, including cannabis or psychedelics, such as, you know, anything from ayahuasca to magic mushrooms to peyote to salvia? Do these play any role in your magical practice? And more generally, do you believe that they are valuable for magicians and aspirants to use? Or do you advise people to stay away from such techniques and stay entirely in the realm of traditional rituals and so forth?
Due to contract, I am obligated to always say that one should never break the laws of their local neighboring government. Now, with that addressed, it is understood that shamans in antiquity would oftentimes go on spirit trips. In order to facilitate these and change their state of consciousness to be prepared and basically primed for the practice, they would use a substance. I would never advise, even if one were to go on such an extreme measure and method, to use any man-made substance. And if they were to still do this, always study what it is you're looking into and what to expect from it. And use a buddy system.
Thank you. Good insight as well. Let me focus my thought on what I was going to ask you next. Okay. To what extent does what we might call soul travel or shamanic journeying into other dimensions, other realms, whether in the form of out-of-body experiences or astral projection, to what extent does that make up part of your practice, and is that inherently part of the magical path, or is that actually a separate thing?
Every mystic I have met has some level of expertise and ability within that, oftentimes astral projection. I myself am quite anchored to my body for reasons that I will not disclose. However, when I was able to do such, it can be very useful because things such as the Akashic Records cannot be reached within the physical plane. One has to go there internally and through a gateway within the mind.
So you mentioned the Akashic Records. Can you give anyone who's not familiar with that concept a quick synopsis of what it represents?
If we were to paint a picture of it, it is essentially a library of the collective unconsciousness, and also known to many as the Library of God itself. Everything that ever will, has been, or can be, is recorded within there.
So is there a way to definitively identify when you have successfully entered the Akashic Records? And I ask because on two separate occasions in my life, I had very profound, intense, like hyper-realistic, like lucid dreams, you might say, but may have been actually astral projections, where I found myself in this infinite library of just incredible, unfathomable dimensions, and on the walls were just every imaginable variation of like grimoire, tome, scrolls made of metal, scrolls made of like blue liquid minerals, you know, huge books made of gold. And then if you opened any of these infinite varieties of books, you would see infinite complex glyphs and symbols like morphing and changing. And every page was just of ever-shifting information as well. So would that have been, in your opinion, the real deal? Or is it possible this was just a dream? And in other words, is there a surefire way to know when you've actually entered the true Akashic Records as opposed to perhaps just having a dream of a spectacular library?
I would say approaching it in the way you described could be said that you stumbled into there. However, you mentioned you could not understand the glyphs. They kept shifting and changing. That knowledge was not for you, and not at this time. When you go there, as I was led there, I was always led to specific manuscripts, specific lessons, and I was not even permitted to stray whatsoever from where I was being guided, which I always, even in retrospect, find very fascinating, because while I could not perceive anyone else present there, there was some something, be it a force, be it a being that I could not fathom or see, directing where I was going and what I was learning. But what you need to find is what you will end up finding there. So I will say you likely stumbled into that place.
Thank you. So given that the Akashic Library is essentially a real and definite astral location of significance, what other significant astral locations that have been clearly, recognized by multiple travelers exist, if any? Is that sort of is it a singular place, or is there also, for example, as I sometimes think, also like an astral museum, for example, or an astral temple, if you see what I'm saying? Are there other locations similar to the Akashic Library in being places where a soul traveler could consciously choose to go on one of his excursions?
For that, you'd need to find someone that was more adventurous. I myself, during my travels, early in my life, came across an ominous large door within the mind. And as I aged, I found other people were intimately familiar with this door, but these people were different than most. And as I came to learn more and more about this door, I ultimately decided and determined, one could literally call it the doorway to God's mindscape itself. But I never found a definitive way to locate this door, or manipulate, or even control the door. It simply comes when it desires. And I would definitely say that door, or whatever is behind it, has a mind all its own.
Fascinating. What is the role of psychic powers in magic? And conversely, what are the differences between magic and psychic power? Are these two separate things, or are they fundamentally at some level one and the same?
Well, it becomes blurry and messy there, because we have to remember that magic is about desire, intention, and will. And psychic powers, being mental, would most definitively have to be about one's own willpower. So it would seem like there's lines there that definitely blur between the two. And if you were witnessing one or the other, how would you know which one you were really seeing versus the other?
Right. Exactly. So now, as someone sets out deeper and deeper into the realm of magic, are there perils? Are there dangers? Is it possible to come to harm? Or is this an entirely safe and productive enterprise?
Anytime one does spirit work or seeks to manipulate the souls of others or themselves, they are treading on very perilous ground that they need, how to say this, to take very, very extensive protective measures. It is a perilous place, and it is not a charted one where you could find any number of books that can truly paint a picture on how to do it well, what to do, and what not to do. It would be much akin to the people that, if I could say it this way, I would liken it to the people that first discovered radiation. They thought they were handling it effectively, and honestly, it ended up killing them. So it is something one must be very careful with.
I see. And so that being the case, what are some of the most important basic precautions or protections that a mage or aspiring adept should always remember to do? Are there amulets that you can carry? Are there sacred herbs that you can burn, or incenses? Are there special prayers or incantations that you should do to prevent or deal with any kind of negative effects?
Oftentimes, magic will involve a spirit, not always, but usually if you're using magic and you're relatively new to it, you will probably be using some manner of spellbook. In it, they will oftentimes depict various incenses or plants you should be burning during it, oftentimes in the form of those mixed into a candle, as well as different metals or gemstones to adorn yourself with. And even then, they might even advise that you yourself stay in a circle. If you try to summon the spirit itself into a circle, that will be considered offensive because it would be like you stepping into my house and you're walking to a cage. Now consider this could be the first person they've spoken to in over 1,000 years. That would make you very cranky if you were in their shoes.
I imagine so, yeah. So I have many more questions, and you can let me know if you're running out of time. But I thought this might be a good option to open it up for audience questions or comments, as we've now covered both alchemy and quite a bit about magic. Does anyone have a question or comment on the subject of magic for Elder Thoth? Did anyone have a question or a comment about magic before I carry on my interview? Very well. Were you going to ask one, Gain?
Well, I was just wondering, like going back to alchemy, if he had covered on a material level what the Philosopher's Stone or the Elixir of Life are.
Mr. Thoth, are you there, my friend? Can you?
I am. I'd be
Yeah.
happy to discuss those in another time and week because those two things are actually very fascinating subjects, but lengthy ones.
I'm really glad you asked that question, Gain, because I had forgotten to, and I do very much want to get your take on that in the future podcast, though. If you could even maybe come back again, if you're interested, and do a whole podcast on the subject of the Philosopher's Stone. I think that would be wonderful because we have another podcast guest and member named of Drew, and Drew did a great podcast on the Philosopher's Stone, and I think it would be wonderful to get your take on that issue. So consider that a formal invitation if you ever have time to come back on in the future.
I would be happy to discuss on that, but not during this session. And if we could get questions, I'd appreciate if we could begin to bring it to a close because I do have
Great.
less to begin approaching.
Understood. Well, thank you so much for your time. So one more time, is there anyone in the audience who wants to ask a question? So that being said, I would like to thank you again so much, Thoth, for your insights, your information, very informative, very illuminating. Again, please send me that link after, and I'll make sure to advertise your server. Everyone, please join the Library of Alexandria. You'll find great resources, great information, everything pertaining to this. Remember, we also have a Magick channel in the podcast, and we have several episodes in the past about alchemy and magic and related topics and Hermeticism. So if you enjoyed this, check those episodes out as well. So Mr. Thoth, for those who are listening in the live audience today, as well as all those who will hear this podcast later on YouTube and BitChute, do you have a takeaway message, a final parting thought, or a specific takeaway that you'd like to leave people with?
None in particular, just that they remain open-minded, consider all the possible paths before themselves, and also approach the ones that could not only improve their lives, but the lives of others around them and the world around them. If we all did that, the world would be a much better place.
Amen. So again, my friend, thank you so much. Wonderful, wonderful material. Really look forward to speaking with you again in a future episode. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you also to the audience. Please make sure you've joined the Roundtable Discord server. We record this podcast every day at 8 p.m. Central. Check out announcements for the upcoming events. We have a great debate tomorrow between myself and Drew on euthanasia and medically assisted suicide. And also check out the hashtag RT podcast channel for hundreds and hundreds of great special events, debates, interviews, and more on our multiple YouTube and BitChute channels. Please like, follow, and subscribe, and share this podcast with your friends and family. We really appreciate it. That's all for today. See you guys again tomorrow. Thanks again to our guest, recorder, and audience. let's jump up to the roundtable voice chat and enjoy the rest of the evening.